Hello friends, and welcome to this unconventional beginning to our confirmation class video number 6. Welcome. We're getting close to Christmas at this time of the year, so I thought it might be fun to kind of show you some of the Christmas decorations I have in my apartment. Yes, I did decorate. Let's see here. First of all, let's look at maybe my little nativity scene there. There you go. It's made from olive wood. I got that in the Holy Land when I was just a young lad when I went there with my parents. And so I think my dad had it for a lot of years, and then before he died, he gave it to my son. So yeah, my dad and I got that in the Holy Land a long time ago, like when I was 12 years old. So that's kind of dear to me. That's the most important thing. There's a few Christmas stockings there. What else do I want to show you? I'm going to show you my tree because it turned out pretty nicely. There it is. Let's see. We got the little angel up there on the top. There she is, shining bright, looking down on you with so much grace. There we are. And there are a few other little things here and there. Behind me, as you will see today, there is some nice, festive garland on the table behind me. All ready for Christmas. This is going to be our last video before the Christmas holiday, so I thought I would just, keep it festive. There we are. So welcome. Thanks for joining me. This is, as I said, video number 6 in confirmation class. You read chapter 5 in Manna and Mercy. You read some biblical passages to do with this, and now I just want to review that and say a little bit later on about why this particular chapter is very important to us as Christians and for the way we worship, in my opinion. But we'll get to that later with kind of a funny story that you will never forget. Okay, so just to review a little bit, while the people were in the wilderness, in wilderness school, God established a covenant relationship with the people, right? As you remember from last time. And God, in that relationship, God promised to be the people's God and bless them by providing them all that they need, right? And then the people in return promised to respond by pledging to live the way of life outlined in the Torah, in the way, in the instruction, particularly the way, the center of which is the 10 Commandments, right? And we looked at those last time, and like traffic laws, right? How to best order a society so that lots of life can flourish for everyone at every level of society. So a very different way of living. From Pharaoh's Egypt, where a few got to flourish at the expense of everybody else in society. This kind of society that God envisioned very different in that it outlined a way of living in which everyone could flourish. The earth itself, animals, and all people. A society in which there were no big deals, no little deals, where people's work consisted primarily of sharing the manna, of sharing the gifts that God gave them so that everybody benefited. So that is kind of the way that was outlined. We sort of went through last time how, remember they went from Egypt through the wilderness to the promised land. That was their route. They were in the wilderness for 40 years in wilderness school. They learned lots of lessons in the wilderness, especially around manna, around the gifts of Sabbath, the Sabbath day, the Sabbath year, and the grand Sabbath year, which happened every 50 years, when the land that would be distributed would be reverted to its original owners, so land and wealth couldn't accumulate in the hands of a few people. They primarily were to incorporate themselves into this way of living week after week after week through their worship, which incorporated them into God's ways of righteousness and mercy, right? Of justice and compassion. And that kept them anchored in that way. They learned other things as they journeyed in wilderness school. They learned to tithe, or to leave a tenth of their crops primarily, to enjoy and celebrate once a year, but also to share with the vulnerable, right? So they were to leave part of their crop for travelers and the poor. And of course, on the Sabbath, they were to rest and enjoy friendship with God, with nature, and with one another. Well, they continue learning and traveling through the wilderness, right? Until finally graduation day comes, and it's time for them to begin to live everything that they had learned in the previous 40 years of being a different kind of people than the world had ever seen before. And so they were getting ready to enter the promised land to live as wilderness people, as God's partner people. Moses delivered a powerful graduation address. He urged them to remember God's act of love toward them and then to respond by living as God's wilderness people. And he said to them, two things. When you live and follow the way of righteousness and mercy, you will bring blessing and happiness to yourselves and to society. Life will flourish. However, when you do not follow the way of righteousness and mercy, you will bring sadness and curse to yourselves and death. As I outlined last time, we have traffic laws for a reason. And when people don't follow them, people die, right? So this was a way of being schooled to order themselves as a society where life could flourish for the most people. God dreamed the result. When his people loved the manna way, all the other nations in the world would be attracted to it and come to learn it. They would say, hey, that looks like a great way to live. So other nations would come and learn to live the manna way, and then in this way, God's people would be blessing to all the families on the earth. That was God's plan. And then God, humans, and nature would live together in peace, and God was very hopeful and felt that the divine dream would come true. Moses dies before he is able to enter the promised land, so he appoints a successor. And the successor's name is Joshua. So it's Joshua's job to lead the people into the promised land, across the Jordan River and into the promised land. Okay, so leadership passes from Moses to Joshua. Now, just to review here, get out the map. So their journey takes them from Egypt through the Red Sea, across the Red Sea, into the wilderness where they journey and learn in wilderness school for 40 years, and then up here to cross the Jordan River under Joshua's leadership so they can enter the promised land and begin to live everything that they've learned. So that is the fundamental thing, right? Egypt across the Red Sea into the wilderness, and then from the wilderness across the Jordan into the promised land to learn, to live what they have learned. So they cross the Jordan River under Joshua's leadership, and the first thing they do is they divide the land because the land is now their manna. So they had practice at sharing manna, right, in the wilderness, and now they're going to live what they've learned by treating the land as manna. So here is a map of how things eventually worked out for them. I think I showed you this before. Each color more or less represents a different tribe's allotment of land. Remember, there were 12 tribes altogether. And so you can see some of the allotments of land are bigger than other ones. And that's because this tribe, the tribe of Judah, was bigger than this tribe, the tribe of Benjamin, which was smaller. So more people lived on this land, but in terms of proportion, more or less, each family got the same amount of land, right? It was equal. So that's how they divided up the land on both sides of the Jordan eventually. Some tribes had land over here, and some tribes had land over here on the other side of the Jordan River. So there's the Dead Sea, there's the Sea of Galilee, here's the River Jordan, just for orientation. Okay. There was one major problem with the people entering this land to live on it as God's people, and it was a big one. The problem is that there were already people living there. Our own country of Canada has come to recognize what a huge problem it is when settling people come to live on a land and treat it as their own when there's already somebody living there. As we know, the First Nations, of course, were here long before any European settlers came. And that has led to a long history of violence and destruction and death and difficulty. And we are still living with that history. It was the same thing in the case of the people entering the Promised Land. The Bible has two quite different views of how the people came to settle on the land. One of those ways, to our shame, I would say, is a very, very violent conquest. Where I would say, as a reader of the Bible, I'm not sure how much blessing the people brought to the people who are already living on the land. Perhaps those stories are included so that we might learn how not to share the land with people. On the other hand, there's another biblical tradition in which the settling of the land is much more peaceful and much more friendly, where the people who are living there extend some grace to the people, to God's people, and share the land with them. So from the beginning, there were problems, and the people struggled, I would say, to put into practice the lessons they had learned in the wilderness, and it was often painful. The pattern that emerges in the book of Judges, which is the book that is much more shows a much more violent kind of settling of the land, is this. They didn't have a king, obviously, at this point. They wanted to get away from having kings and emperors and pharaohs and all that, big deals and little deals. So what would happen, in the biblical picture we get, is that when the people did indeed follow the covenant way, things went quite well for them. When they departed from that, when they forgot the way, when perhaps they worshipped the gods of the people who were already living on the land, things did not go so well. And then the people surrounding them took advantage of them, pestered them, and they would need to defend themselves. So then God would raise up leaders for them for a short time to protect the innocent and the vulnerable. In the English Bible, the title of these people is kind of funny. They weren't kings because it was just temporary, and when everything was fine, things went back to normal. But they're called judges. And they weren't really judges in the sense of we think of judges. They were temporary leaders, sometimes military leaders, for a short time. They could be male or female. And the only thing that separated them from everyone else was that for a short time, God's Spirit would rest on them. There are 16 of them named in the Bible. And so here they are. Here's the judges. Here's a list of biblical judges. Some of the more famous ones you would know. Joshua himself was a judge. Deborah was another famous judge. Gideon, you've probably heard of. Samson, Samuel functioned as a judge. So there they are. And from time to time, God would raise up these leaders to help their people. So no kings among the people at this time, and that was by design. This was not a society that was designed to have big deals and little deals like the nations around them. They were to function differently. The people, when they were true to God, they worshiped God with all their strength, right? So worship kept them committed as a society to the wilderness way, to the manna way. It was worship that helped ground them in who they were, in being this different kind of people than the world had ever seen. They confessed their faith daily in the words of the Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. On festival days and Sabbath day, they shared ritual meals together, just as we do every Sunday. We share a ritual meal called Holy Communion. They shared ritual meals together where they shared manna, and then they told stories about their past. A story that answered some of their deepest questions about life, like, say, the story about the man and the woman, and the first man and the first woman in the garden. They especially love to tell stories about their ancestors, about Abraham, say, and Sarah, who believed God's promise that they would be parents of a great nation and who would bless all the families of the earth. This was important. They always told stories, just like we do in worship. When we gather, we hear stories about these same people from the Bible. It keeps us grounded as a people and in our purpose as a community. So they told stories, listened to stories, and shared sacred ritual meals. Sounds very much like what we do on Sunday mornings. Story after story was told, and they functioned how God hoped they would. The stories told people over and over what God is like, and they helped the people become people of memory and hope. So people knew who they were because of their past, and because of how God had blessed them in the past, and the people knew who they were because of the future God had promised them, a future of peace and shalom, where they would function as a manna society, and where all the peoples of the earth would be blessed through their work. Now, I've already given you some hints that this period of time when the people began to worship as a way of God's continuing to form them into the people God called them to be, this is very formative for how we worship, and it works exactly the same for us. So in order to help you think about this, I'm going to tell you a story that happened a long time ago at First Lutheran Church. It's when we were thinking about renovating or changing the worship space. The worship space, when I got here 20 years ago, was a little bit different from the way it is now. And the people were thinking about rearranging it, so they did. I used to sit up on that stage part at the front called the chancel, but the people wanted me to come down, so I was closer to them and sit with them. The altar also used to be up there, but again, the people wanted to come down so it could be in the middle of them, so God's presence would be symbolized right in our midst. We would be like a people that gathered around the gifts of God. Nobody would be higher than anybody else. We would be closer together. The choir used to sing in the balcony. They came down too and joined us on the floor, so we were all on one level. Much more like a family gathered around a meal for a meal together. Well, that all came to be. Most of those ideas came to be, and we had a meeting or several meetings where people could share their suggestions with the planning committee. So at one of those meetings, I made a suggestion. There were probably about 70 or 80 people at the meeting, and people were sharing their ideas, and I said, well, I have an idea, and this is my idea. I think we should put in a huge moat. You know what a moat is? Like the channel of water that surrounds a castle to protect it. I said, I think we should have a moat all the way around our worship space, fill it with water, and then when we come into the worship space, it would be like we're crossing the Red Sea, just like the God's people did all those years ago. It would be like we're crossing the Red Sea into the wilderness. And during worship, it would be like God is schooling us in the ways of manna and mercy. We would hear God's stories, we would hear God's teaching, and we would share the manna, the bread and wine, and we'd share it equally, right? You know how it works, Holy Communion. Nobody gets too much, nobody gets too little. We all receive the same amount. We all share the gifts of God, and it would be like we would be in wilderness school. And then at the end of the service, when we go out, we would have to cross over the moat again, only this time it would be like we are graduating and we're crossing the Jordan River to take the gifts we've received out into the world to be God's people of blessing and live what we've learned in worship in the wilderness school. Well, I said that, and friends, let me tell you, following that, I sat down and there was deafening silence like you have never heard before. After what seemed like excruciating minutes passed by, somebody said, "Does anyone else have any suggestions?" That was it for my big suggestion. It died a quick death. No moat for First Lutheran Church. Sadly, it's a dream I have. It'll never happen, but in my mind, this is what is happening every single Sunday. I drew it for you because I am so attached to this idea, and I'll never let it go. Okay, so here we are. Here's our worship space, and there's the altar in the middle of the people. There's where the choir sits. Here's where I sit and other people over here, and there's more pews. And here's the moat of water around our worship space that I imagine. Here's a little bridge or something across the water. I guess, you know, we wouldn't have to have a bridge. You could just take your shoes off and wade through the water like they did way back in the day. So here's coming in, crossing the Red Sea waters in to receive the gifts of manna and learn to share and live as God's people. So that's what happens when we cross the waters in. And then at the end of the service, when we go out, cross the Jordan rivers out, to take the gifts of manna, you know, all the gifts we receive, love, forgiveness, mercy, justice, all those good things. Take those gifts out with us to share in the world and live what we have learned and share what we have received. So there it is. Every time you come to worship now at First Lutheran Church, when we're able to gather again, you can imagine this in your mind, because I do. Graduation day, settling down. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. Thank you for your participation in confirmation class up until this point. I've had a lot of fun doing these videos. It's been a lot of work to prepare, but I hope that you have been able to experience some of the fun, some of the enjoyment that I've had making these for you. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas and a wonderful holiday. A very Merry Christmas to you and to your families. I wish you every blessing. I'll be in touch again in mid-January so that we can resume, but until then, have some rest. Enjoy your family members. Enjoy friends in whatever way you can connect with them, even if that is only over FaceTime or whatever right now. That's what I'm doing, and I'm really enjoying it. So take some time, enjoy, rest, take a break. You deserve it. Remember that I love you, God loves you, and I wish you every blessing. Be well, friends. See you next time. Bye-bye.